So, we're going to be looking at a part of the Christmas story that actually I think many of us may know relatively well. We're going to be looking at the wise men. And I'm going to take a moment to kind of disperse some of the weirdness traditions that we've put in to these gentlemen who seem to rock up from somewhere in the Far East. And then we're going to take a look at actually and just try and work out, okay, so now we know what's going on in the story. What on earth does this mean to us today as we're sitting here? And then what can we take from that actually brings in similarities between the bread and the wine that we're going to be taking communion in a little while as well. So we're looking at Matthew chapter 2, and I've asked Susie if she'd come and do our reading today. So I'm going to hand over to Susie. So it's a slightly longer passage than we would normally have. So I hope you're sitting comfortably, because Susie's about to begin.
Matthew chapter 2. Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. About that time, some wise men from the eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose, and we have come to worship him." King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as everyone in Jerusalem. He called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, "Where is the Messiah supposed to be born?" "In Bethlehem in Judea," they said, "for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem of the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd of my people, Israel." Then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, "Go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child, and when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go worship him too." After this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. When it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. After the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother," the angel said. "Stay here until I tell you to return. Stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." That night Joseph left for Egypt with the child and Mary, his mother, and they stayed there until Herod's death. This fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophets, "I called my son out of Egypt." Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. "A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead." When Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. "Get up," the angel said, "take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who are trying to kill the child are dead." So Joseph got up and returned to the land of Israel with Jesus and his mother. But when he learned that the new ruler of Judea was Herod's son Archelaus, he was afraid to go there. Then, after being warned in a dream, he left for the region of Galilee. So the family went and lived in a town called Nazareth. This fulfilled the prophets had said, "He will be called a Nazarene."
Well, thank you, Susie, for such a huge chunk of scripture. So let's start by being mean and just stripping this back a little bit and actually looking at what's going on here. So the first thing that we need to note from this is that we're in the middle of King Herod's reign. King Herod was often nicknamed as Herod the Great. He was the first Herod of Israel. He was appointed by the Romans to rule. So he's not a Jewish king. He's been appointed king of that area on behalf of Rome. But actually, he did a load of really good things. If you were to look him up, you'd find that actually he was great, and as I was nicknamed, a master builder. He's somebody who built huge temples. So he actually restored much of the Jewish temple to its former glory. He rebuilt whole sections of the city that had been destroyed, big... what's the word I'm looking for? Palaces as well. But he wasn't necessarily interested in just making Israel and the Jewish faith better. He also built temples to numerous different other gods of the Romans as well. So this is who he was. He wasn't a nice person. He had his wife murdered and had a whole section of his own children murdered because he didn't like her anymore. He wanted to marry somebody else, and then was worried that the children of the first wife would then end up taking over the throne. So, like I said, so he's great in one sense, hideous in another. Okay, and the people of Israel didn't particularly like him, yet the ruling Jewish leaders liked him because he rebuilt the temple. So he seemed to do a bit of both. This is right at the very end of his life. He was very ill. And he was living in one of his big palaces that he'd made in Jericho and spending half his time between the two. So this just gives you an idea of what's going on there. So he's aware that his life is about to end, and he's already appointed the son who is going to reign in his stead, and that we find out his name right at the end of this when he's scared to go back. So we know that the son is about to take over in his stead. What's interesting is that the son is not a nice person, and actually the Jews hated him even more, and so the emperor actually disposed of him to put somebody else on the throne because he was worried there was going to be a massive revolt from the Jewish people. Now, you may have heard me mention in the past that this time-wise contains smack in the center of two of the biggest Jewish revolts against the Roman Empire. About 30, 40 years before Jesus actually arrives on the scene, there was a huge big battle, and the Jewish people stood up against the Romans and actually momentarily won a victory. And then the Romans came in and absolutely squashed them. And then at the end of Jesus' lifetime, AD 70, AD 80, roughly in that sort of area, is when the Jewish people revolt again. And this time the Roman Empire absolutely snuffs out Israel, and everything goes really bad for them. So you're in the midst of these two things. So tensions are big. So you've got to be aware of this. The tension is actually quite big. So when you understand that we've got this group of wise men that turn up, and Herod, as it says, is naturally deeply disturbed, as we're told in verse 3, you can understand why he's disturbed. Because he knows his own life is going to come to an end shortly. He's already appointed the son, and now there's a new baby who is called King of the Jews. So this causes a major issue. So that's Herod. But let's take a look at the wise men. Okay, so we know that we've got wise men from the east. Who are these wise men? Well, first of all, we're told the Greek for it is magi, and that means somebody who is interested in the stars, that's interested in wisdom, sometimes nicknamed to those who are interested in magic. There's this sense of those that are deeply learned and who their lives revolve around wisdom. And so we have these magi, these people that were called, in our translation, wise men, because it's the easiest translation rather than saying learned of and then give you a big massive list. But they're not kings. So if you remember our Christmas carol that sings, "We three kings of Orient are," well, this is a great song that talks about three people who are kings of Orient, which would suggest they're probably from somewhere in China. Why is this what we've got as a song? Well, because we know that they're from the East. So us in England, as we're writing hymns, we're going to write it with the knowledge that we have. And so you hear of it, three gifts. So that must mean that there's three people. And that kings, because gold and the gifts they're given are very expensive. We're going to look at the gifts in a moment. So tradition has given it that there are three, that they are kings, and that they are from somewhere in the Orient, because we understand East. But what we've got to think is that the Jewish author here is talking about the East. It's east of him, not east of us. Does that make sense? So it's actually from an area that at the time would have been nicknamed as being Babylon area. And so it's probably somewhere over towards Iran, that kind of area. We're smack in the Middle East. And so there's lots of thoughts as to where that was. But the general thought is that they've traveled roughly about 800 miles to be able to be there. So roughly 800 miles to get there. So that's a decent walk. And even if they were doing it on camels, it's a decent trek, 20 miles per day. So that gives you 40 days worth of travel. That's if they didn't stop at all on the way. So I want to take a look just at the wise men in this story. We know that when they arrive, that King Herod grants them an audience. Now, if I was to imagine that three just learned people turned up in Israel at this time and requested an audience with the king, I would be surprised if they got granted that. Because, well, it's the king of a country. Why would he permit this? And especially if we know that he's actually, at this point, not very well. So why does he permit it? Well, there's something about this, and it says that the whole of Jerusalem, it says, and everyone in Jerusalem was disturbed by this, which would suggest that actually there's something about this group of wise men that has piqued the interest of Israel. It's actually commonly believed that there would have been a lot of people that were there. That from wherever these guys had come, had managed to drum up so much excitement because there was something going on. And we're going to look at the something in a minute. But that there's so much excitement that's going on that as they've come, that there's a huge group of people that are traveling. So it's not going to be just three lonely wise men who have arrived. It's likely to have been a whole group of people turning up that would have caused Jerusalem to have sat up when you've got a whole big group of people that are coming in search of this new king. Okay? So the likelihood is that actually the wise men would have probably have been, we're talking at least 20 or 30 people that would have rocked up there. Now, because we see the three gifts, tradition has allowed us to put it down to three. But what's going on at the moment? What caused these wise men to sit up and pay attention? Well, we know that there is a star that is in the sky. And this star that is in the sky is of such a nature that has caused them to sit up and pay attention. And it's been in the sky for quite a long time, so it rules out a shooting star, because for them to have traveled 40 days worth whilst the star's in the sky would suggest that that's a really slow-moving shooting star. So it's not a shooting star. It's probably equally, it's not going to be a convergence of planets as well, which would also suggest that it was, because they're following the star. You wouldn't follow the star if it's somewhere out there. The nature of this is something in the heavens has happened that has caused them to go, what is this? The common belief is that maybe it was something of an angelic behavior, that maybe that there was an angel or lights permitted by God or a specific star, but it's clearly sitting somewhere that's within the distance between Earth and the known stars. They're wise people, so these guys have spent time learning, so they would have known by looking at the various different religious writings, maybe something's happened, and they've actually managed to work out that this is something to do with a king has been born. And because of the dispersion of the Jews over the centuries, that wherever they are, as if this is somewhere in Iran, the likelihood is that there would already be Jewish people that were there. So they would be able to get hold of the Jewish writings. And you've heard me talk about the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament in Greek form, was now readily available thanks to the printing of the Egyptians in the latter part of the BC. So actually they would have been able to get hold of the religious writings of the Jewish people and actually be able to work out, oh, there is something in this. I love this because when he says they came to him asking, where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star as it rose and we have come to worship him. So there's an element of, they've clearly seen that there's something in the scriptures that point at a king being born. And what they're actually doing here is they're quoting from Numbers chapter 24 and verse 17. So this is a prophet called Balaam. Great story about Balaam if you fancy reading up on him. He's a bit of a loose cannon. But he quotes this from God and he says this. He says, I see him, but not here and now. I perceive him, but far in the distant future. A star will rise from Jacob, a scepter will emerge from Israel. And then he goes on to explain what this new king will do. And so there's this sense that these wise men have searched through scriptures and have recognized that all of the Septuagint, all of the Old Testament that we know is pointing towards a Messiah. And the whole of the writing is suggesting that something amazing is going to happen. And then suddenly, out of the blue, a star arrives in the sky that's enough to make you sit up and go, that's not normal. So they begin to scour through all the religious scripts that would be around at the time to see if there's anything that would suggest that something amazing is about to happen. And then clearly they've stumbled through the religious writings of the Jews and gone, okay, a king is born. So let's go and worship. Now, you would be forgiven for going, okay, wow, this is great, and make a note of it, footnote somewhere, and then just carried on with your day. But I love that these wise men didn't just go, oh, wow, something cool's happening in Israel. Right, what are we having for tea? Right? Which you could understand how that would happen. But they decide, no, actually, we want to go and see this. And so they set out. And then it suggests that the star itself disappears for a brief moment, because we then see that the star reappears. So for it to reappear suggests that it's no longer in the sky at the moment. So they know that they're on the way towards Israel. And where would you go if you're going to search out the king to be born? Well, you would turn to probably where the king's going to be, which would be the capital, which is Jerusalem. So that's why they turn up at Jerusalem. And they go and they meet with the King Herod, and they're excited to meet his newborn son. And Herod is quite confused, because last he checked, he hadn't had a newborn son. So we've got this moment where they're just trying to work out what is going on. And this causes a huge disturbance. So in the midst of Jerusalem, a huge big group of wise men, plus all of their entourage and camels and all the other stuff that's come with it, have turned up. So again, just to show you just how much the leading priests are in the pocket of Herod, he calls for an audience, and they're straight away in the midst of this. And when he asks them, where is this Messiah to be born? We then get the prophecy, which is in Bethlehem. So then once he works out that that's where it is, he then suggests that they go and worship on Herod's behalf. Herod doesn't go, again, because we know Herod's actually not well at this point. And so he sends them with strict instructions to come back and tell us where he is. I mean, he could have sent some of his people, but he didn't. And actually, I'm really glad that he didn't, because as we see the story unfold, actually, this is not a loving gesture from a loving king over a newborn baby. But this also leads us to something else. So as they go, we turn up, and it says that in verse 9, after this interview, the wise men went their way. Beg your pardon, let's go back a little bit. Verse 8. Then he told them, oh yeah, that was right. After this interview, so the interview was with the king, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. Again, this is a moving star, so I want us to grab this. And it went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were filled with joy, and they entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary. A few things I want for us to grab here. First is, where is Jesus at this point? Well, it says he's in a, did anyone catch it? He's in a house. Yes, he's in a house. So he's not in a stable at this point. Also, when describing him in Luke's gospel, he's very clearly called a baby. And yet in Matthew's gospel, we're told that he's a child. Okay? So there's a slight twist here. If we then fast forward, now we've already had this given. If we fast forward, when the wise men choose not to go back to Herod because they were warned in a dream, Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Okay, so what we need to grab here is, first of all, there is a mass brutality. This is a lot of overshadowing of what we saw with Moses in the book of Exodus. But at the same time, this is one of these amazing moments where we realize that actually, perhaps the story that we've grown so accustomed to, and for those of you who have enjoyed going along to a nativity and have watched your children dress up as lobsters and the likes, you'll be aware of that we have this whole big procession and everybody's crammed inside the stable to visit this newborn baby. And in the midst of it, we've got donkeys, we've got cows. Interestingly, on some nativities, we've had pigs, which always makes me giggle because they're Jewish and they don't eat pork. We've got the wise men that are stuffed in there next to the shepherd. But actually, what we see here is completely different. So time-wise, Jesus has been born, and has been born for quite a while. They've chosen to remain here in Bethlehem. They could have gone back to the place to which he was from, originally Joseph was from, but they've chosen to stay where they are and to choose to make a life of where they are at the moment within Bethlehem. And so we know that Joseph is a carpenter, which actually the word carpenter, when it's translated for us, actually is much more of essentially like a joiner. A lot of their houses would be built out of wood and mixtures of wood and stone. Joseph was somebody who would have been quite adept, probably at building his own house and then building his own business. And there would always be need for more joiners and carpenters on the scene. So we've got Joseph and Mary who are now no longer stuffed inside the place where the animals live, but they've now got their own house. Jesus is no longer a newborn baby, but he's going to be at the oldest 2, at the youngest about 18 months. Okay, so to give you an idea, so this is no longer Jesus in a manger. This is Jesus probably running around with garbled Hebrew in his mouth as he's trying to get his mouth around words and learning. He's probably in the middle of toilet training. Are we allowed to imagine Jesus like this? Right? But this is the Jesus that these wise men will have arrived and would have met. And so, again, I love this. I understand why over the years tradition has permitted us to put together a nativity, why the wise men rock up at the same place as everything else is going on, because it's convenient. Otherwise, you've got to say, get an entirely new cast almost and a new different Jesus to be able to make the second half of the story work. I get it. I understand how we as Brits here in the West have translated a story that we read on face value and make it work for us in our setting. Which is why we have carols like In the Bleak Midwinter. And yeah, if you're in the Middle East, snow is not something you see very often. And you know, we've got all of these carols which are written to help us as believers in the West grasp Jesus in a way that we can feel is tangible, rather than giving us a story of a boy born in a land that we can't even imagine the animals that lived there. I always think it's interesting reading historical novels and them talking about lions, because they know the word because it's in scripture, but they've never seen one because they're not native to our country. And they're trying to imagine what it would look like. And some people would translate lions as being two-headed animals and stuff, because it doesn't make sense. It's not something they're aware of. And so you can understand how, as Brits, over the years, traditions have happened. But this story in itself, I think, is wonderful. And I want just to kind of take a moment just to disperse a few bits before we then jump in and look at the here and now. The last thing I want to look at are the three gifts. What are the three gifts? Well, I've heard it often said that the three gifts are gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Not quite. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But yeah, but again, to us, these are three things, that one of which we know. The other two, again, are not really within our dialect. You know, for what would we use frankincense, and for what would we use myrrh? Now, I want you to be aware that these guys that have turned up are giving something that is specific to what they understand from the Old Testament. These will be gifts that would mark out what they know this Jewish king will be. So the first one is, he will be a king. So the most obvious gift that you would give to a king is gold. So they turn up with gold. Now imagine Mary and Joseph. They're scrimping together with as much as they can to be able to get a life together. He's a carpenter, which is a trade that would always be work, but he's not going to be somebody who's going to be rolling in money. This is essentially working class. It's a tradesman. So imagine these guys turn up. It ought to have been weird enough a couple of years back when a load of shepherds turned up to worship the baby. Now we've got a whole entourage of people that have just turned up, and the first gift they are presented with is gold. This would be one of those moments where they're again reminded that the babe in their midst, the child in their midst, is more than just the norm. Yeah? Gold. Second thing that they give is frankincense. Now, what is frankincense? Frankincense is the only thing that is used in offerings to create the wonderful smells that are involved in the temple. And the only people that actually have access to this are the priests. And the people that burn this incense are the priests. And so everything about frankincense means two things. First is, it means worship. And you would go to the temple to worship God. And so everything in the Old Testament suggests that the great high priest, this is what they're aware of. So not only is this babe in their midst a king, but they're also marking him to say that actually he's also something to be assisted in with worship. And that's why they've come to worship. And so frankincense is an incense that its only place that it is found is in the midst of the temple, in the midst of worship. And so this is the first time that we've got this glimpse of people coming to worship Jesus. And the one thing that they bring is that they've researched this. And they know it's not just any sweet-smelling smell, but they bring the only incense that's permitted to be burnt inside the Jewish temple. This is big. The last thing that they bring is myrrh. Now to us again, myrrh is an interesting one. What's that to do with? Well, actually, myrrh is one of the substances which is mixed together, and then particularly in in the Middle East, where it's very hot. When somebody dies, they didn't bury people in the ground, but more often than not, they were tombs that were given. But again, the decomposure of the human body once somebody dies means that actually it would be, if it wasn't treated, that it would be very smelly. And so myrrh is a substance that is used that actually helps prolong the body so that actually it doesn't smell. And so the sole purpose of myrrh is to do with death. It marks death. And it's something that, again, particularly within this part of Israel, would have been something that was commonly seen as being an item of death. When we see Jesus at the end, when he is taken into his tomb, the following day when the women are allowed to tend to the body, they turn up with myrrh in their midst in order to treat Jesus' body for burial. Except they arrive and find that Jesus is now no longer dead, but he's risen. So the three things that they see fit to bring king of Israel, according to the Old Testament, according to the Septuagint, is the marking of a king, is the fact that this king will also be a high priest. And the third thing is that this king would die a death that would be fit for that purpose, that we've got this sense that this king is actually marked for death. And that's what we know. And so for us, as we look at this story today, I just want us just to grab this, is that this Jesus that we worship, it's easy for us sometimes, particularly at Christmas, to kind of get Jesus into our head as being this little baby. And yes, that's where he started off. But his purpose was that he would die on a cross. And this is what we know. And we're going to be taking communion in a moment. And I just want for us just to grab this, that the babe that was there was also marked for death. That this person whose sole purpose was to die on a cross to be able to take away the sins of you and me is somebody that we worship. Hence, that's why we've got frankincense. And that this isn't just some random person who was out just teaching in the wilderness, but this is somebody who was recognized from birth as being the King of the Jews, the King, the Son of God. And this is the God that we worship. Jesus himself comes from heaven to earth, choosing to set aside the riches of heaven in order to be able to be in our midst and to walk with the people of Israel, to teach them as they go through, to give them glimpses of heaven through the miracles that he provides, so that people would begin to see God for who he was and worship again, to bring the hearts of Israel back to God. That's the sense of what was Jesus's mission. And then finally was to die on a cross, a criminal's death when he was innocent, in order to be able to take the sins of you and me so that we can no longer be trapped in our wrongdoings of our past, but instead be washed completely clean, that we might be able to come into his kingdom as he wants. And then finally, the end of this story is that then they have to go on the run. I often wonder what happened to those three gifts. Does Mary hold on to these three things? Well, I imagine on the run in Egypt, I imagine the gold would have come in really handy. The concept of frankincense, would that be something that they would have sold? Would that be something that they would have held on to? But from Mary's point, the reminder that her little boy would someday die, that must resonate throughout all of his life. And I wonder, on that day that Jesus is on the cross, would she have reflected back on this moment and realized the poignancy of these wise men from the east turning up with something for burial for her son? It makes you wonder that none of this is a mistake. The story of Jesus dying on the cross isn't where it goes wrong. It's where it goes right. And it was set aside from the very beginning. And Jesus was almost, these gifts are prophetic as they stand aside to say of who he is. So as we come to communion now, on the last Sunday of Christmas, as we've still got the Christmas decorations up and around us, yes, We're about to take them down. It's the reminder that actually Christmas has come to an end. But from the moment of Jesus' birth, his death was appointed. And it's not a sad death, but it's a death that signifies the wonder of you and I being welcomed into his family. And so as we take communion this morning, I just want to encourage us just to remember, yes, we're talking about toddler Jesus this morning. But this Jesus is the one who grows up and who sets a new blaze in history that resonates today, and that his death and then resurrection is what brings us into his family.